Propaganda rarely builds new structures in the mind. More often, it occupies structures that were already there. One of the most significant of these is the human capacity to distort facts as a coping mechanism. We find this idea in our literature, our philosophy, and our universities. In the last century, the dynamics of this idea have been formalized into specific psychological terms, terms like cognitive dissonance, rationalization, and cognitive bias. The term cognitive bias describes how people process information to arrive at a preferred conclusion. If a fact causes guilt or threatens a person's identity, their brain will actively seek flaws in that fact, reject it, or reframe it until the guilt is neutralized. Coined by psychoanalyst Ernest Jones in 1908 and popularized by Anna Freud as an ego defense mechanism, the concept of rationalization is the act of inventing plausible, socially acceptable explanations for behaviors that are actually motivated by darker, more self-serving, or destructive impulses. It allows a person to commit a harmful act while maintaining the illusion of moral integrity. The adaptation of rationalization acts like a psychological immune system. It quickly neutralizes the threat of guilt and restores cognitive equilibrium, allowing the individual to remain decisive, confident, and focused on immediate survival tasks rather than being bogged down by existential dread. The term cognitive dissonance describes the psychological discomfort a person feels when they hold two contradictory beliefs or when their actions conflict with their beliefs. Because this tension is deeply uncomfortable, the human brain subconsciously changes its narrative to resolve the conflict. Instead of accepting the guilt, the brain recasts the facts, allowing us to believe guilt is not warranted because they deserved it, or we had no choice. Psychologist Ervin Staub has shown how such coping mechanisms can act as an accelerant for violence. This pattern often begins with severe societal frustration, which compromises the psychological well-being of the population, leading to an evolution of coping mechanisms involving scapegoating and devaluing a certain target group as inferior, dangerous, or out of step with moral obligation. These are the precursors of Staub's most famous concept, the continuum of destruction, a series of small incremental steps beginning with minor acts of discrimination or hostility that go unpunished, followed by a psychological change which occurs and allows people to justify their actions and avoid guilt. This is followed by small but increasing acts of harm which make larger acts of violence more conceivable and eventually acceptable. Modern social media silos can facilitate this, allowing different groups to live in entirely different factual universes, making it easier to dehumanize those in the other silo. Grievances on both sides are artificially amplified on these platforms, justifying mandates for absolute control. Staub's research suggests that once a society is sufficiently polarized, it becomes easier for authoritarian leadership to cast institutional checks, the judiciary, the free press, and the legislature as obstructionist or corrupt. Eventually, political movements define themselves primarily by their opposition, by a dangerous or evil internal enemy, at which point the psychological groundwork for violence is laid. Just as individuals can be incrementally desensitized to immoral behavior towards other people, so too can entire societies be incrementally desensitized to accepting previously unthinkable public policies. In political science, sociology, and philosophy, several leading voices and frameworks explain this exact phenomenon of incremental policy normalization. One of the most prominent structural models of this concept is the Overton window, or the window of discourse, conceived by policy analyst Joseph Overton in the 1990s. The theory states that at any given time, there's a narrow band of public policies considered politically acceptable to the mainstream population. Policies outside this window are viewed as radical or unthinkable. However, the window can be deliberately shifted. By consistently introducing and repeating ideas at the extreme fringes, the margins of the window stretch. What was once considered radical or unthinkable gradually shifts to acceptable, then sensible, and finally codified policy. The public doesn't change its mind overnight. Rather, the boundaries of tolerated discourse are slowly moved. The concept of the banality of evil was coined by political theorist Hannah Arendt in her 1963 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. It describes how systemic atrocities can be committed by ordinary, unremarkable people who simply conform to bureaucratic systems and unquestioningly follow orders. Arendt developed this idea while covering the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi official responsible for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust. Instead of an extremist ideological mastermind, she observed an average, bureaucratically minded man who viewed his participation in mass murder as just his job. Arendt was one of the most influential political theorists of the 20th century, known especially for her attempts to explain how ordinary people become involved in totalitarian systems, emphasizing how the public sphere becomes saturated with so much conflicting, manipulative, and sensational information that citizens can no longer discern what is true, or even care what is true. Arendt saw this not as an aberration, but as a new form of politics, rule through epistemic instability. In this mindset, there is no absolute moral or historical standard. Everything is relative. And when yesterday's extreme becomes today's baseline, the threshold for tomorrow's oppression can easily be lowered. This is the foundational psychological engine that allows totalitarian leaders to rise to power amid widespread, enthusiastic public support. When dynamic leaders like Hitler, Stalin, or Mao took power, they didn't just impose their will through raw physical force. They offered a psychological lifeline to a deeply traumatized, humiliated society in a state of psychological crisis. The human brain cannot survive indefinitely in a state of high anxiety and existential dread. It desperately seeks a defense mechanism to restore a positive self-image. Totalitarian leaders step into this vacuum with a grand narrative that recasts its citizens from helpless victims into heroic participants in a grand cosmic drama, simultaneously scapegoating a target group as saboteurs, parasites, or subhumans who threaten the collective. Once a population accepts that lifeline, their collective psychological immune system goes to work to protect that new sense of security and pride at any cost, even if it means altering reality itself. The thunderous applause heard at mass rallies in Nuremberg, Moscow, or Beijing was an expression of deep, authentic relief, applauding the entity that took away their shame, their economic terror, and their existential isolation. The human mind will gladly fracture the mirror of objective truth and aggressively silence anyone who dares to point out the cracks.